You're listening to the 3 Feet Radio Show with Ben Carbonaro and Luke Herbert. From our studios come special guests and netball commentary, exclusively on YouTube.
Welcome, listeners, to this latest installment of the 3 Feet Radio Show. I am Luke Herbert, and joining me in the studio today is my esteemed co-host Ben Carbonaro, who's a noted netball journalist for Netball Scoop. And in today's program, we're going to be wrapping up the Commonwealth Games netball, and we're going to be discussing the outcomes and what were our biggest disappointments and naturally highlights. And now, we know that New Zealand got caned by the Australians in the final by 18 goals. But before we move on to the final, I think we're going to start off with the team that disappointed us most. So, Ben, to get us underway, which of the teams at the Commonwealth Games netball tournament disappointed you the most?
Well, first of all, Luke, thanks for the opportunity to come onto the show, like it always is. Great to be talking some Commonwealth Games netball. We're talking on the 5th of August, which is a day after the closing ceremony over there in Glasgow. I'd say the team that disappointed me the most was England. I think the fact that they lost to Australia in pool play, and they led by as much as 6 goals. But then, come within, I think it was the last minute or so of the game, they just couldn't get the job done. And Australia snatched back the lead to win by 1 in what was an absolute thriller. And also, I think maybe Malawi disappointed me a little bit too. Especially with Michael Wender having an outstanding year with the mainland tactics in the ANZ Championship. You would have thought that might have been a bit of a bit of motivation for Malawi to do well, because they've the last couple of years in major tournaments they've certainly done very, very well.
Well, the truth be told, in my view, I think New Zealand should have lost to Malawi in that opening game. Malawi were the better side, and I think it would have been a truer reflection of the form of the New Zealand squad. But coming back to England, yeah, England's the major disappointment for me at the tournament as well, because I believe they had an historic opportunity to beat the Australian squad in pool play. And I'm going to come back to my reasoning a little later in the show, but it comes down to the selections that Lisa Alexander and her fellow coaches and selectors made. And I think the Australian lineup would have been a little less settled than perhaps it would have been in previous years, just because you saw the likes of Aaron Bell omitted from the squad. So those are the kind of opportunities a team like England gets to pull off an upset, because what I find exciting about the Commonwealth Games and the Netball World Cup, although less so now that Australia and New Zealand will play each other in pool play at the World Cup, is the one-off nature of the games. You only need to play one good game if you're England, or two, and you're into the final, and you can upset the apple cart. Now, Australia beating England in pool play would have certainly given the game a shot in the arm that it could do within the UK in terms of attracting more supporters and sponsors.
Netball certainly would. It would be good for netball to have a shot in the arm. We've got the Netball Super League, and netball's well on its way. But at the same time too, if England would have beaten Australia, there would have been all sorts of questions asked in the Australian media here, and the fans, they would have gone mental on social media. We know what social media is like with netball now, Luke.
Oh, there would have been a lot of disappointment. And that leads me into the next topic, the selections made by the respective coaches and selectors of the two teams that made the final, the Australia and New Zealand sides. And we'll start with the Australian squad. Now, when we interviewed Lisa Alexander on this program, one of the questions we asked her is, did you select the squad with a specific game plan in mind? And of course, you and I weren't aware of the exact answer, and Lisa Alexander wasn't going to give it away on this program. But I think we can now say fairly safely that the Australian squad was picked with one job in mind, to beat New Zealand in the final. And they took a calculated risk that the squad they chose would get past England and Jamaica, and they calculated correctly. So what are your thoughts on that, Ben?
My thoughts are that Lisa Alexander, I think, did pick a team to play to a specific game plan, and that was one that was very much centred on full court pressure and full court defence. What we saw in a lot of the games was we saw Australia starting games well and dominating early on. Although against Wales, that was probably a little bit different. But in the other games, we saw some very dominant performances all across the court. And what's interesting too is the fact that in the final, we didn't even see Kim Green on the court. What we saw in the final was we saw Maddie Robinson stay on court for the whole game, and Kim Green not even get a start. And we saw Tegan Caldwell play a little bit during pool play as well. But other than the odd bit of pool play, we didn't really see too many changes in the Australian side at all, Luke.
Well, no, and I think it comes back to what I was alluding to. The Australian side had been selected basically to do one job. And that's why when I mentioned earlier England missed an historic opportunity for a winning pool play is one of the reasons why I think they're going to really rue that result in future years, is that because the Australian side had been picked to beat New Zealand, the English weren't able to exploit that fact. And we'll come back to the English coaches a bit later on, but I think some of their thinking and decisions was a bit out as well. But then shifting on to the New Zealand selectors who chose what I term a fairly conservative squad. What's your thoughts on the New Zealand squad and the players that went to Glasgow? And we'll come back to the injuries in a moment, but I just want your thoughts on the actual selection of the players and if it was the right mix or not.
I don't necessarily think it was the right mix, Luke, and I say that because what we saw some players going into the tournament underdone, or players picked purely on reputation. I mean, look at the whole Leona Leota saga. Yeah, she's got her husband in the UK, but I mean, really, should that be a reason why she was selected? She might be a good player, but she'd hardly had any ANZ court time leading into the Commonwealth Games. So I think that might have been a bit of a token selection, as much as controversial as that may sound.
Well, just to add a bit of balance to this program, I need to point out that in the last 4 years, Netball New Zealand has ignored the need to improve player and development pathways, and we've discussed this on this show in the past, so I'm not going to go into that topic now because it's a bit of a side topic and I don't want to rant on it. That's for a future program.
One thing I will say, Luke, before we go on about the player development pathways, was interesting. I saw something on Facebook the other day. I forget which page was on and who wrote it, but it was they said if Netball New Zealand wants to develop more quality goal shooters or goalers in general for the Silver Ferns program, we need to get rid of the imports. But that's a different issue within itself. Do you believe that the imports thing is blocking the pathway of talented New Zealand shooters?
Well, you could obviously make that argument, but I would probably, without getting into a whole side discussion, I would probably say at this time I would simply say no, because our lack of development pathways have meant that there just haven't been players to step up to the plate. And in short, I think our lack of development pathways mean that when a New Zealand player enters the ANZ Championship, it takes them an extra 2 years to say reach the standard of netball required to play at the international level. Now, this hasn't always been the case. There's exceptions like Kayla Cullen, but I am speaking very generally. And now that, just moving away from the lack of development pathways in New Zealand and back to the selection of the New Zealand squad, yes, there were too many players in the New Zealand squad that either lacked match fitness or earned their spot on reputation. Now, I've already alluded to the jam the selectors were in because the lack of development pathways meant that there wasn't so many obvious replacements for, say, a defender who was a bit out of form. And I'm not going to name any names in this conversation just because, you could pick on 3 or 4 players, but I do have to sort of draw a line somewhere. But certainly, the selectors could have taken a punt on someone like Phoenix Karaka and brought her into the squad. And ultimately, if I'm going to fault the New Zealand coaches and selectors, it's because they were simply outsmarted by their Australian counterparts. They simply brought what I would term the status quo to the table. The New Zealand coaches, when they saw the New Zealand side was named, knew what the side was capable of. There wasn't anything new brought to the table, and ultimately that has shined through in the final result. But just staying with the Australia-New Zealand in the final for a moment, obviously the injuries the Silver Ferns suffered from, and it was a horrific injury toll. They were just about needing a hospital ship to send the players back home on.
The injuries were so bad, Luke. There was talk on the Netball Download group on Facebook, which we're both members of. G'day to members there that are listening to this show today. That Vicky Wilson would have to come in and wear the black dress, wasn't there? Well,
they weren't too far off. I mean, just about every New Zealand shooter in the squad had been injured at some point in the tournament. But just from your point of view, Ben, how much do you think the injuries played in the final result, or what part did they play, or how big a part?
I think the injuries played a little bit of a part, probably to the extent that players were coming in and out of the side underdone, and probably the combinations probably weren't as strong as they could have been had they not had to chop and change that attack end all the time.
My personal estimation is that the injuries for our shooters cost us probably 10 goals in the final, which, if you do some simple maths, if they hadn't been injured, we would have lost by, say, 8 goals. So I don't think they influenced the final result. And I think, too, there are signs that this coaching staff didn't have a lot of confidence in some of the players they picked. Certainly the fact that Jolene Henry played on with a broken finger and there was an obvious replacement or replacements for her wing defence in the squad shows that for whatever reason players got picked in the New Zealand squad that the coaches didn't have sufficient confidence in. And my argument is that being the case, those players are players who shouldn't have been there to start with. So if we can just move along from the final, I think we're going to come back to the English squad, and I deliberately didn't deal with this early on in the program because I didn't want to devote a whole chunk of the program entirely to the English side. But at the last couple of major tournaments, the last World Cup, and now at the most recent edition of the Commonwealth Games, the English coaches at the time have made some baffling coaching decisions. And at the Commonwealth Games just past, we saw Jay Clark benched in both the pool game against Australia and the semi against New Zealand, and I haven't been able to fathom a good reason for that, and I've never fathomed a good reason for, I think it was Jeeva Mentor who was benched in a semi at the last World Champs. So how much do you think these baffling coaching decisions, Ben, and have sort of played into the fact that England's come up short at these big tournaments?
I think it's had a bit to do with the bad results for England, Luke. I mean, you don't drop Jay Clark to the bench just for the sake of it, and same with Jeeva Mentor. Sure, both players might have bad points in their game sometimes, but they're two world-class players, and they probably almost certainly have got the ability to rebound after a bad game or after a bad minute or two. I mean, that's sport for you. Just because a player has a bad moment or two, you don't automatically drag them, do you?
And it raises questions too, because the English had some players out on court that were committing a high error rate that weren't benched. So I would have to question the decisions made. And also I think too, another sign that the Australian coaches and selectors simply used their intellect and were smarter than their opponents is the fact that even though that pool game against Australia was going to be crucial, the English side wasn't selected on the basis solely to defeat Australia. Now, granted, England and New Zealand don't have the depth Australia has in players, but that game, with due respect to the other pool games, should have had a target painted on its back. And, I think while the English players did understand its importance, I don't think the coaching staff quite did, for the reasons we've talked about. And I don't think the English players ever mentally recovered from losing to Australia. They certainly, sort of showed it a bit against New Zealand in the semi, which, again, they never really recovered from mentally, which I believe that's what led them to lose the bronze medal game. But what are your thoughts on the results of the bronze medal game, Ben?
The bronze medal game, I think it's great that Jamaica were actually able to grab a medal, because usually in these tournaments we've seen England get the bronze medal. You just have to see the elation in the Jamaican girls' faces or in their eyes. Some of the photos I saw coming from Glasgow Online, and I think it's great that they were able to do so well. I think it's a credit to them. I think it's a credit to Jamaica for just persisting and pushing hard, but at the same time too, benching Clark, like you said, probably did cost England a chance to get a bronze medal in some ways. But also the fact that they went down to Australia in pool play and got really close is another disappointing factor of their tournament too.
With netball being one of the premier sports at the Commonwealth Games, I would like to see there a larger gap being put in place between the final and the semis and the bronze medal game. Because even though they are top level players, I think the players need to be in the best shape possible mentally and physically for those games, and we'd have a better spectacle if we had a day or two in between the semis and the bronze medal playoff and the final. So what's your thoughts on that, Ben?
I think you're certainly going in the right direction. It's something I've been thinking about myself too, Luke. You would have thought maybe having a day in between those major games would help the teams to prepare maybe a little bit better and have a break in between and that sort of thing. Because at the same time too, one of the features of playing in tournaments like this is you've got to be mentally tough and play back-to-back games. I know Lisa Alexander's spoken to me about this several times when I was still working at Netball Australia, where unfortunately I don't work anymore, but it just shows mental toughness is very important in tournaments like this. But at the same time too, it could help having a day in between some of these major games.
Yeah, I think both arguments are valid, and I'm going to chuck that one out to the listener to see what they think, and I'm going to thank the listener for joining us here on the 3 Feet Radio program.
And just one for the listeners here, Luke. It'd be great if they could get on Twitter or Facebook and tell us what they'd like to hear more of, or any ideas for guests they'd like covered coming up. The reason why I say that is because we're sort of in a bit of a block at the moment in between the Commonwealth Games and the International Test Series in October, and there's a bit of ANZ Championship player movement, no doubt, which we'll cover in future shows, but it'd be great to hear from them what they would like to hear.
You've been listening to the 3 Feet Radio Show with Ben Carbonaro and Luke Herbert. Tune in next time for more special guests and netball commentary exclusively on YouTube.